The fourth President of the United States. James Madison, 1809 to 1817. The names, biographies, and achievements of the Presidents of the United States since its founding. We continue the fourth President of the United States of America. The fourth President of the United States. James Madison, 1809 to 1817. Part 3. In the years prior to the war, Jefferson and Madison had reduced the size of the military, leaving the country with a military force consisting mostly of poorly trained militia members. Madison asked Congress to quickly put the country into an armor and an attitude demanded by the crisis, specifically recommending expansion of the Army and Navy. Given the circumstances involving Napoleon in Europe, Madison initially believed the war would result in a quick American victory. Madison ordered 3 landed military spearhead incursions into Canada, starting from Fort Detroit, designed to loosen British control around American-held Fort Niagara and destroy the British supply lines from Montreal. These actions would gain leverage for concessions to protect American shipping in the Atlantic. Without a standing army, Madison counted on regular state militias to rally to the flag and invade Canada. Still, governors in the Northeast failed to cooperate. The British Army was more organized, used professional soldiers, and fostered an alliance with Native American tribes led by Tecumseh. On August 16, during the British siege of Detroit, Major General William Hull panicked after the British fired on the fort, killing 2 American officers. Terrified of an Indian attack, drinking heavily, Hull quickly ordered a white tablecloth out a window and unconditionally surrendered Fort Detroit and his entire army to British Major General Sir Isaac Brock. Hull was court-martialed for cowardice, but Madison intervened and saved him from being shot. On October 13, a separate force from the United States was defeated at Queenston Heights, although Brock was killed. Commanding General Henry Dearborn, hampered by mutinous New England infantry, retreated to winter quarters near Albany, failing to destroy Montreal's vulnerable British supply lines. Lacking adequate revenue to fund the war, the Madison administration was forced to rely on high-interest loans furnished by bankers in New York City and Philadelphia. In the 1812 presidential election, held during the early stages of the war, Madison was re-nominated without opposition. A dissident group of New York Democratic Republicans nominated DeWitt Clinton, the lieutenant governor of New York and a nephew of recently deceased Vice President George Clinton, to oppose Madison in the 1812 election. This faction of Democratic Republicans hoped to unseat the president by forging a coalition among Democratic Republicans opposed to the coming war, as well as those party faithful angry with Madison for not moving more decisively toward war, Northerners weary of the Virginia dynasty and Southern control of the White House, and many New Englanders wanted Madison replaced. Dismayed about their prospects of beating Madison, a group of top Federalists met with Clinton's supporters to discuss a unification strategy. Difficult as it was for them to join forces, they nominated Clinton for president and Jared Ingersoll, a Philadelphia lawyer, for vice president. Hoping to shore up his support in the Northeast, where the War of 1812 was unpopular, Madison selected Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts as his running mate, though Gerry would only survive 2 years after the election due to old age. Despite the maneuverings of Clinton and the Federalists, Madison won re-election, though by the narrowest margin of any election since that of 1800 in the popular vote, as later supported by the electoral vote as well. He received 128 electoral votes to 89 for Clinton. With Clinton winning most of the Northeast, Madison won Pennsylvania in addition to having swept the South and the West, which ensured his victory. After the disastrous start to the war, Madison accepted Russia's invitation to arbitrate and sent a delegation led by Gallatin and John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, to Europe to negotiate a peace treaty. While Madison worked to end the war, the United States experienced some impressive naval successes by the USS Constitution and other warships that boosted American morale. Victorious in the Battle of Lake Erie, the U.S. crippled the supply and reinforcement of British military forces in the western theater of the war. General William Henry Harrison defeated the forces of the British and of Tecumseh's Confederacy at the Battle of the Thames. The death of Tecumseh in that battle marked the permanent end of armed Native American resistance in the Old Northwest and any hope of a united Indian nation. In March 1814, Major General Andrew Jackson broke the resistance of the British allied Muskogee Creek in the Old Southwest with his victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Despite those successes, the British continued to repel American attempts to invade Canada, and a British force captured Fort Niagara and burned the American city of Buffalo in late 1813. On August 24, 1814, the British landed a large force on the shores of Chesapeake Bay and routed General William Winder's army at the Battle of Bladensburg. Madison, who had earlier inspected Winder's army, escaped British capture by fleeing to Virginia, though the British captured Washington and burned many of its buildings, including the White House. Dawley had abandoned the capital and fled to Virginia, but only after securing the portrait of George Washington. The charred remains of the Capitol signified a humiliating defeat for James Madison and America. On August 27, Madison returned to Washington to view the carnage of the city. Dawley returned the next day, and on September 8, the Madisons moved into the Octagon House. The British Army next advanced on Baltimore, but the U.S. repelled the British attack in the Battle of Baltimore, and the British Army departed from the Chesapeake region in September. That same month, U.S. forces repelled a British invasion from Canada with a victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh. The British public began to turn against the war in North America, and British leaders began to look for a quick exit from the conflict. In January 1815, Jackson's troops defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Just more than a month later, Madison learned that his negotiators had concluded the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814, which ended the war. Madison quickly sent the treaty to the Senate, which ratified it on February 16, 1815. Although the overall result of the war ended in a standoff, the quick succession of events at the end of the war, including the burning of the Capitol, the Battle of New Orleans, and the Treaty of Ghent, made it appear as though American valor at New Orleans had forced the British to surrender. This view, while inaccurate, strongly contributed to bolstering Madison's reputation as president. Napoleon's defeat at the June 1815 Battle of Waterloo brought a final close to the Napoleonic Wars and thus an end to the hostile seizure of American shipping by British and French forces. The post-war period of Madison's second term saw the transition into the era of good feelings between mid-1815 and 1817, with the Federalists experiencing a further decline in influence. During the war, delegates from the New England states held the Hartford Convention, where they asked for several amendments to the Constitution. Though the Hartford Convention did not explicitly call for the secession of New England, the convention became an adverse political millstone around the Federalist Party as general American sentiment had moved towards a celebrated unity among the states in what they saw as a successful Second War of Independence from Britain. Madison hastened the decline of the Federalists by adopting several programs he had previously opposed. Recognizing the difficulties of financing the war and the necessity of an institution to regulate American currency, Madison proposed the re-establishment of a national bank. He also called for increased spending on the Army and the Navy, a tariff designed to protect American goods from foreign competition, and a constitutional amendment authorizing the federal government to fund the construction of internal improvements such as roads and canals. Madison's initiatives to now act on behalf of a national bank appeared to reverse his earlier opposition to Hamilton and were opposed by strict constructionists such as John Randolph, who stated that Madison's proposals now out Hamilton's Alexander Hamilton. Responding to Madison's proposals, the 14th Congress compiled one of the most productive legislative records up to that point in history. Congress granted the Second Bank of the United States a 25-year charter and passed the Tariff of 1816, which set high import duties for all goods that were produced outside the United States. Madison approved federal spending on the Cumberland Road, which provided a link to the country's western lands. Still, in his last act before leaving office, he blocked further federal spending on internal improvements by vetoing the Bonus Bill of 1817, arguing that it unduly exceeded the limits of the General Welfare Clause concerning such improvements. Upon becoming president, Madison said the federal government's duty was to convert Native Americans by the participation of the improvements of which the human mind and manners are susceptible in a civilized state. In 1809, General Harrison began to push for a treaty to open more land for white American settlement. The Miami, Wee, and Kickapoo were vehemently opposed to selling any more land around the Wabash River. Harrison decided, against the wishes of Madison, to to first conclude a treaty with the tribes who were willing to sell and use those treaties to help influence those who held out. In September 1809, Harrison invited the Pottawatomie, Delaware, Eel Rivers, and Miami to a meeting in Fort Wayne. Harrison promised large subsidies and direct payments to the tribes if they would cede the other lands under discussion. On September 30, 1809, Madison agreed to the Treaty of Fort Wayne, negotiated and signed by Indiana Territory's Governor Harrison. In the treaty, the American Indian tribes were compensated $5,200, equivalent to $90,092.77 in 2021, in goods and $500 in cash, equivalent to $8,662.77 in 2021, with $250 in annual payments, equivalent to $4,331.38 in 2021, in return for the cession of 3 million acres of land, approximately 12,140 square kilometers, with incentivized subsidies paid to individual tribes for exerting their influence over less cooperative tribes. The treaty angered Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who said, "Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea, as well as the earth?" Like Jefferson, Madison had a paternalistic attitude toward American Indians, encouraging them to become farmers. Madison believed the adoption of European-style agriculture would help Native Americans assimilate the values of British U.S. civilization. As pioneers and settlers moved west into large tracts of Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw territory, Madison ordered the U.S. Army to protect native lands from intrusion by settlers. This was done to the chagrin of his military commander Andrew Jackson, who wanted Madison to ignore Indian pleas to stop the invasion of their lands. Tensions continued to mount between the United States and Tecumseh over the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne, which ultimately led to Tecumseh's alliance with the British and the Battle of Tippecanoe on November 7, 1811, in the Northwest Territory. The divisions among the Native American leaders were bitter, and before leaving the discussions, Tecumseh informed Harrison that unless the terms of the negotiated treaty were largely nullified, he would seek an alliance with the British. The situation continued to escalate, eventually leading to the outbreak of hostilities between Tecumseh's followers and American settlers later that year. Tensions continued to rise, leading to the Battle of Tippecanoe during a period sometimes called Tecumseh's War. Tecumseh was defeated and Indians were pushed off their tribal lands, replaced entirely by white settlers. In addition to the Battle of the Thames and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, other wars with American Indians included the Peoria War and the Creek War. Negotiated by Jackson, in the aftermath of the Creek War, the Treaty of Fort Jackson of August 9, 1814, added approximately 23 million acres of land, 93,000 square kilometers, to Georgia and Alabama. Privately, Madison did not believe American Indians could be fully assimilated to the values of Euro-American culture and may have been unwilling to make the transition from the hunter, or even the herdsman state, to the agriculture. Madison feared that Native Americans had too great an influence on the settlers they interacted with, who in his view was irresistibly attracted by that complete liberty, that freedom from bonds, obligations, duties, that absence of care and anxiety which characterized the savage state. In March 1816, Madison's Secretary of War William Crawford advocated for the government to encourage intermarriages between Native Americans and whites as a way of assimilating the former. This prompted public outrage and exacerbated anti-indigenous bigotry among white Americans, as seen in hostile letters sent to Madison, who remained publicly silent on the issue. In the 1816 presidential election, Madison and Jefferson both favored the candidacy of Secretary of State James Monroe, who defeated Secretary of War William H. Crawford in the party's congressional nominating caucus. As the Federalist Party continued to collapse, Monroe easily defeated Federalist candidate, New York Senator Rufus King, in the 1816 election. Madison left office as a popular president. Former President Adams wrote that Madison had acquired more glory and established more union than all his three predecessors, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, put together. When Madison left office in 1817 at age 65, he retired to Montpelier. As with both Washington and Jefferson, Madison left the presidency poorer than when he came in. His plantation experienced a steady financial collapse due to price declines in tobacco and his stepson's mismanagement. In his retirement, Madison occasionally became involved in public affairs, advising Andrew Jackson and other presidents. He remained out of the public debate over the Missouri Compromise, though he privately complained about the North's opposition to the extension of slavery. Madison had warm relations with all four of the major candidates in the 1824 presidential election, but, like Jefferson, largely stayed out of the race. During Jackson's presidency, Madison publicly disavowed the nullification movement and argued that no state had the right to secede. Madison also helped Jefferson establish the University of Virginia. In 1826, after the death of Jefferson, Madison was appointed as the second rector of the university. He retained the position as college chancellor for 10 years until his death in 1836. In 1829, at the age of 78, Madison was chosen as a representative to the Virginia Constitutional Convention for revision of the Commonwealth's Constitution. It was his last appearance as a statesman. Apportionment of adequate representation was the central issue at the convention for the western districts of Virginia. The increased population in the Piedmont and western parts of the state were not proportionately represented in the legislature. Western reformers also wanted to extend suffrage to all white men, in place of the prevailing property ownership requirement. Madison made modest gains but was disappointed at the failure of Virginians to extend suffrage to all white men. In his later years, Madison became highly concerned about his historical legacy. He resorted to modifying letters and other documents in his possession, changing days and dates, and adding and deleting words and sentences. By his late 70s, Madison's self-editing of his own archived letters and older materials had become almost an obsession. As an example, he edited a letter written to Jefferson criticizing Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. Madison not only inked out original passages but in other correspondence he even forged Jefferson's handwriting. Historian Drew R. McCoy wrote, "During the final 6 years of his life, amid a sea of personal, financial troubles that were threatening to engulf him. At times, mental agitation issued in physical collapse. For the better part of a year in 1831 and 1832 he was bedridden, if not silenced. Literally sick with anxiety, he began to despair of his ability to make himself understood by his fellow citizens." Madison's health slowly deteriorated through the 1830s. He died of congestive heart failure at Montpelier on the morning of June 28, 1836, at the age of 85. According to one common account of his final moments, he was given his breakfast, which he tried eating but was unable to swallow. His favorite niece, Nellie Madison Willis, who sat by to keep him company, asked him, "What is the matter, Uncle James?" Madison died immediately after he replied, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." He was buried in the family cemetery at Montpelier. He was one of the last prominent members of the Revolutionary War generation to die. His last will and testament left significant sums to the American Colonization Society, Princeton, and the University of Virginia, as well as $30,000, $897,000 in 2021, to his wife, Dolly. Left with a smaller sum than James had intended, Dolly suffered financial troubles until her death in 1849. In the 1840s, Dolly sold Montpelier, its remaining slaves, and the furnishings to pay off outstanding debts. Paul Jennings, one of Madison's younger slaves, later recalled in his memoir, in the last days of her life, before Congress purchased her husband's papers, she was in a state of absolute poverty, and I think sometimes suffered for the necessaries of life. While I was a servant to Mr. Webster, he often sent me to her with a market basket full of provisions, and told me whenever I saw anything in the house that I thought she was in need of, to take it to her. I often did this, and occasionally gave her small sums from my own pocket, though I had years before bought my freedom of her. During his first stint in Congress in the 1780s, Madison came to favor amending the Articles of Confederation to provide for a stronger central government. In the 1790s, he led the opposition to Hamilton's centralizing policies and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Madison's support of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in the 1790s has been referred to as a breathtaking evolution for a man who had pleaded at the Constitutional Convention that the federal government should possess a veto over state laws. Others historians disagree, and see Madison's political philosophy as remarkably consistent. Perhaps more importantly, they point out that Madison's loyalty was to the Constitution, not to his personal preferences. Madison had advocated in the debates of the Constitutional Convention that the proposed federal government have veto power over state laws, but he was willing to follow the Constitution as it was adopted and ratified, rather than what he might have wished that it said. Madison had written in Federalist No. 45 that the proposed federal government would have powers that were few and defined, as enumerated in Article 1 of the Constitution. He felt strongly that to interpret it otherwise would be a breach of faith with we the people who had ratified the Constitution based on that understanding. Madison, who was the author of the Bill of Rights, was also faithfully following the 10th Amendment, which says that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Although baptized as an Anglican and educated by Presbyterian clergymen, young Madison was an avid reader of English deist tracts. As an adult, Madison paid little attention to religious matters. Though most historians have found little indication of his religious leanings after he left college, some scholars indicate he leaned toward deism. Others maintain that Madison accepted Christian tenets and formed his outlook on life with a Christian worldview. Regardless of his own religious beliefs, Madison believed in religious liberty, and he advocated for Virginia's disestablishment of religious institutions sponsored by the state. He also opposed the appointments of chaplains for Congress and the armed forces, arguing that the appointments produce religious exclusion as well as political disharmony. Throughout his life, Madison's views on slavery were conflicted. He was born into a plantation society that relied on slave labor, and both sides of his family profited from tobacco farming. While he viewed slavery as essential to the Southern economy, he was troubled by the instability of a society that depended on a large slave population. Madison also believed slavery was incompatible with American revolutionary principles, though he owned over 100 African American slaves. According to historian Paris Spies-Gans, Madison's anti-slavery thought was strongest at the height of revolutionary politics. But by the early 1800s, when in a position to truly impact policy, he failed to follow through on these views. Spies-Gans concluded, ultimately, Madison's personal dependence on slavery led him to question his own, once enlightened, definition of liberty itself. Madison grew up on Montpelier, which like other Southern plantations depended on slave labor. When Madison left for college on August 10, 1769, he arrived at Princeton accompanied by his slave Sawney, who was charged with Madison's expenses and with relaying messages to his family back home. In 1783, fearing the possibility of a slave rebellion at Montpelier, Madison emancipated one slave, Billy, selling him into a 7-year apprentice contract. After his manumission, Billy changed his name to William Gardner and became a shipping agent, representing Madison in Philadelphia. Madison inherited Montpelier and its more than 100 slaves after his father's death in 1801. That same year, Madison moved to Washington, D.C., running Montpelier from afar, making no effort to free his slaves. After his election to the presidency in 1808, Madison brought his slaves to the White House. During the 1820s and 1830s, Madison sold some of his land and slaves to repay debt. In 1836, at the time of Madison's death, he owned 36 taxable slaves. In his will, Madison gave his remaining slaves to his wife Dolly and charged her not to sell the slaves without their permission. For reasons of necessity, Dolly sold the slaves without their permission to pay off debts. As was consistent with the established social norms of Virginia society, Madison was known from his farm papers for advocating the humane treatment of his slaves. He instructed an overseer to treat the Negroes with all the humanity and kindness consistent with their necessary subordination and work. Madison also ensured that his slaves had milk cows and meals for their daily food. By the 1790s, Madison's slave Sawney was an overseer of part of the plantation. Some slaves at Montpelier could read. Paul Jennings was a slave of the Madisons for 48 years and served as Madison's footman at the White House. In his memoir, A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison, published in 1865, Jennings said that he never knew Madison to strike a slave, although he had over 100. Neither would he allow an overseer to do it. Although Jennings condemned slavery, he said that James was one of the best men that ever lived, and that Dolly was a remarkably fine woman. Madison called slavery the most oppressive dominion that ever existed, and he had a lifelong abhorrence for it. In 1785, Madison spoke in the Virginia Assembly favoring a bill that Thomas Jefferson had proposed for the gradual abolition of slavery, and he also helped defeat a bill designed to outlaw the manumission of individual slaves. As a slaveholder, Madison was aware that owning slaves was not consistent with revolutionary values, but, as a pragmatist, this sort of self-contradiction was a common feature in his political career. Historian Drew R. McCoy said that Madison's anti-slavery principles were indeed impeccable. Historian Ralph Ketchum said, Though Madison abhorred slavery, he nonetheless bore the burden of depending all his life on a slave system that he could never square with his Republican beliefs. There is no evidence Madison thought black people were inferior. Madison believed blacks and whites were unlikely to coexist peacefully due to the prejudices of the whites as well as feelings on both sides inspired by their former relation as oppressors and oppressed. As such, he became interested in the idea of freedmen establishing colonies in Africa and later served as the president of the American Colonization Society, which relocated former slaves to Liberia. Madison believed that this solution offered a gradual, long-term, but potentially feasible means of eradicating slavery in the United States, but that peaceful coexistence between the two racial groups could eventually be achieved in the long run. Madison initially opposed the Constitution's 20-year protection of the foreign slave trade, but he eventually accepted it as a necessary compromise to get the South to ratify the document. He also proposed that apportionment in the House of Representatives be according to each state's free and enslaved population, eventually leading to the adoption of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Madison supported the extension of slavery into the West during the Missouri Crisis of 1819 to 1821, asserting that the spread of slavery would not lead to more slaves, but rather diminish their generative increase through dispersing them, thus substantially improving their condition, accelerating emancipation, easing racial tensions, and increasing partial manumissions. Madison thought of slaves as wayward but still educable students in need of regular guidance. Regarded as one of the founding fathers of the United States, Madison had a wide influence on the founding of the nation and upon the early development of American constitutional government and foreign policy. Historian J.C.A. Stagg writes that in some ways, because he was on the winning side of every important issue facing the young nation from 1776 to 1816, Madison was the most successful and possibly the most influential of all the founding fathers. Though he helped found a major political party and served as the fourth president, his legacy has largely been defined by his contributions to the Constitution. Even in his own life, he was hailed as the father of the Constitution. Law professor Noah Feldman writes that Madison invented and theorized the modern ideal of an expanded, federal constitution that combines local self-government with an overarching national order. Feldman adds that Madison's model of liberty protecting constitutional government is the most influential American idea in global political history. Various rankings of historians and political scientists tend to rank Madison as an above-average president, with a 2018 poll of the American Political Science Association's Presidents and Executive Politics section ranking Madison as the 12th best president. Various historians have criticized Madison's tenure as president. In 1968, Henry Steele Commager and Richard B. Morris said the conventional view of Madison was of an incapable president who mismanaged an unnecessary war. A 2006 poll of historians ranked Madison's failure to prevent the War of 1812 as the sixth worst mistake made by a sitting president. Regarding Madison's consistency and adaptability of policymaking during his many years of political activity, historian Gordon S. Wood says that Lance Banning, as in his Sacred Fire of Liberty, 1995, is the only present-day scholar to maintain that Madison did not change his views in the 1790s. During and after the War of 1812, Madison came to support several of the policies that he opposed in the 1790s, including the National Bank, a strong navy, and direct taxes. Wood notes that many historians struggle to understand Madison, but Wood looks at him in the terms of Madison's own times, as a nationalist but one with a different conception of nationalism from that of the Federalists. Gary Rosen uses other approaches to suggest Madison's consistency. Historian Gary Wills wrote, "Madison's claim on our admiration does not rest on a perfect consistency, any more than it rests on his presidency. He has other virtues. As a framer and defender of the Constitution, he had no peer. No man could do everything for the country, not even Washington. Madison did more than most, and did some things better than any. That was quite enough." Montpelier, the Madison family's plantation, has been designated a National Historic Landmark. The James Madison Memorial Building is part of the United States Library of Congress and serves as the official memorial to Madison. In 1986, Congress created the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation as part of the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution. Other memorials include Madison, Wisconsin and Madison County, Alabama, which were both named for Madison, as were Madison Square Garden, James Madison University, and the USS James Madison. In 2021, the Madison Metropolitan School District renamed James Madison Memorial High School following community opposition to commemorating someone who used slave labor. Madison, portrayed by Burgess Meredith, is a key protagonist in the 1946 film Magnificent Doll, a fictionalized account of Dolly Madison's romantic life. Madison is also portrayed in the popular musical Hamilton, played by Joshua Henry in the original 2013 Vassar version and then revised by Okiriate Onadawan for the 2015 Broadway opening. Onadawan won a Grammy Award for his portrayal of Madison. I stop at this point today. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the world's incredible stories. Soon we will publish the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, 1817 to 1825. Thank you for watching.